All right, so this is chapter 39 for incident management. This is a brief overview of incident management. I'm going to put some videos where you guys can also access them from the incident management team at NIMS. And this is also a reminder, if you have not gotten your incident management, your NIMS training done, you need to have that done, and it's going to take you quite a bit of time to do it. All right, so we have chapter 39, incident management. Let's go where we can click it. All right, so we're going to talk about MCIs, triages, and then the incident command system here. Again, this is an overview. You should have a pretty good idea already about what the incident management team does and our role within the incident management team if you've done your NIMS training. We also are going to, in class during the Q&A, go over triage tags. Every department does triage slightly different, but there's the same basic principle behind it. I should say every region does it slightly different or can do it slightly different. There is a general understanding among agencies that overlap each other that they're going to do some triage. Their triage is going to be using the same technique, either the ribbon or it's going to use the triage cards or a combination of both. So when we declare an MCI, this is where we have a lack of resources, right? Mass casualty incidents, or we have 3 or more patients. Basically, we're overwhelmed by the unit that's responding to it. The resources available are too much for what the current, what's happening is too much for the current resources to handle. And then we have the incident command system that we need to practice. I used to tease one of the departments I was at because everything we went on, they took a command on. But then when something big happened, everybody was versed in how incident command works. The NIMS system and incident management system came around after 9/11. We realized how poorly we communicated interagency after 9/11 and what we need to do to fix it. And it's by no means perfect, but we do have a way that we've established a mutual understanding in terminology, because terminology and communication is one of the biggest breakdowns. When they went back and looked at 9/11, communication was the biggest falling breakdown. And when you look at any near miss or line of duty death, one of the top 3 things listed is going to be a communication breakdown. So NIMS was implemented in 2004. It's basically a framework you can start big and work your way down, or start small and build it back up. So let's say that we have like the wildfires that are going on currently right now. So it starts in this little fire, and then we can build upon that as the incident increases. And then as we can start having a de-escalation, we can release resources to go to other places. And it kind of organized all the municipalities involved, but also private sector things like utilities, schools, local governments, to kind of incorporate everything together. When it first came about, the NIMS book was huge. And I was like, oh, federal government really made something that could have been easy, uncomplicated, into something really huge. And then I had a different perspective of things when I was like, wow, this really works. And when I live back east, terminology is different. If I order a bus back east, I'm getting an ambulance. If I order a bus here, I'm getting a school bus. So we really had to kind of standardize those things so that we could be able to have that communication that works for everybody. All right, so it has to be rapidly adaptable. When we talk about resource classification, personnel training certification, the NIMS that you guys are doing as a co-requisite for this class are required by the National Education, EMS Education kind of guidelines that we use to teach and the National Registry works off of. And those are the bare minimum guidelines. You can go forward and get a degree in NIMS and in emergency management and disaster preparedness. And then you can specialize in each one of those fields. So I take my EMT, I specialize in logistics and planning using my degree in emergency management. So those are things I really enjoy doing. But there's all sorts of different ways that you can specialize or you end up working under the incident management team. When we start out as EMTs and firefighters, we basically are what they call the boots on the ground. So we run under the operations sector. All right, so preparedness, being ready for things. We can't plan for every inevitability, but we can have a guide map to use when something happens. Things that you don't realize is any big event. So a concert, a race, when we have those big 5Ks, all of those have a plan in the background that mimics the disaster, the National Incident Command System. So if something does happen, there's a plan in place to respond to it. We don't realize all the work that goes on in the background when we're the boots on the ground. Okay, so the biggest thing with ICS is to ensure that we're safe and the public is safe. And then we have goals. So we have goals every 24 hours, or what they call an operational time period. Most of those for big incidents are 24 hours. Sometimes they're 12 hours for smaller incidents. So we want to make sure we achieve those goals and that we're using resources efficiently. I responded to Hurricane Katrina, and when that occurred, the resources that we had there were just sitting on the ground and not being utilized. I watched food go to waste on pallets because we got all this stuff there and there was no way to disperse it to everybody. So, you know, this is something that we're always trying to make better, is efficient use of resources. Right? Also controls duplication of efforts or freelancing that goes on when you have people go, oh, I'm just going to go help out in this sector, or I'm just going to go do this. That causes people to get injured because you don't know, command doesn't know that somebody's over here freelancing doing their own thing. And then we have organizational levels. So when we break things apart, branches, divisions, and groups, those are all broken apart and they have the span of control under each one of these. And the span of control is ideally 3 to 5 or 6 people for the span of control. So here are some of the basic command systems. So everything in red would be a command, and then underneath it are the branches and then the divisions or groups and then strike teams that come out underneath. So when you guys start, we're going to be in operations, and we'll talk about that a little bit further, but we're just boots on the ground. I like the planning and the logistics parts. That's my specialty. I like planning because it's like throwing a party in the middle of nowhere and kind of thinking about everything you're going to need for it. And then that runs right into logistics. So that's my specialty. I like doing that. Finance, nobody really thinks about that until they want to get paid for showing up at that disaster management or at that wildfire. So command, this is who's ultimately in charge. We have the command structure. And then there's an incident commander. Finance group, that's who pays for things when certain money is released for certain incidents. Governors have to request certain amounts of money. The mayors, local municipalities have to request money. And so nothing gets paid for unless that money is requested through the right channels. Logistics, how are we going to feed all these people? How are we going to have bathrooms available for all of these people if it's going to be a long time frame? How are we going to have areas for them to rest, sleep, rehydrate? Operations is the working part of it. So these are where the firefighters play in, tactical rescue, extrication crews. Planning, there's a planning that sits on a planning commander that sits on the incident command team in the structure. This planning sector leader or section leader is responsible for what's going to happen in the next 24 hours, so the operational goals for the next operational time period. But also when there isn't something going on, the planning gets together and they come up with this rough draft of a plan, like for wildfires and wildland. So in the off season, those are always kind of being formulated with who's going to be available as resources nearby, who can we pull resources from. And then they all fall underneath this command staff. So incident commander is overall the person in charge. It doesn't matter if that person works for your agency or not. They are the ones ultimately responsible for the life safety of everybody on that entire incident. If they give you an order, it's to be taken as golden rule, all right? The other person who can it has the voice of a commander is the safety officer. We'll talk about safety officers here in a minute. All right, so it's important to know where the command is basically stationed or where they're housed, who the commander is. Now, we don't get to just go in as part of the operation boots on the ground to the command post and be like, what's up, all right? We have to go through the right channels, through our span of control and through our strike team leaders or through our group leaders. And then if there's a prolonged kind of incident, so we don't want to burn out our commanders, usually 14 days, like on wildland, we rotate out who's IC. Or if somebody with more experience comes in, because somebody, let's say there's a fire wildland and we call it initial attack. So the local jurisdiction takes initial attack and then they bring in, a level 1 strike team. That incident commander from that strike team will take over for that incident commander if they feel that they are better equipped. When there's a shift in responsibility, whoever's if there's an operations section manager and they're rotating off their time, So their 14 days is on, somebody else is coming on. There's a rule that they always have to have a face-to-face meeting to rotate over. So this goes back through finance, reimbursement, purchasing of stuff. Their job has to be an absolute nightmare. I can't even imagine, because people need things, you know, here and there, and then trying to make sure everybody's getting paid at the end of this is a big deal. Logistics is communications, food. Where are we going to house these people? Are we camping? Where are we going to put base camp up? Do we need tents? Do we need a command tent? How are we going to get fuel for all of this equipment, especially if it's out in the middle of nowhere? And then, you know, do we have to have a medical section? So do we need medical equipment for mass casualties? What about if our people get hurt or sick, right? Operations, this is, like I said, us, the firefighters, EMTs, paramedics that are sitting there working through it. And then the planning division, this is the incident action plan that goes into place, establishing the goals for the operational period, and then basically problem solving any problems that come up when they arise. And that's the part that I really like. All right, within the command staff, we also have somebody called the safety officers. Everybody is responsible for safety on an incident. So we all have that responsibility to look out for our safety and the safety of the people around us. But the safety officers ultimately reports directly to the incident commander, and they ensure things like OSHA rules are being taken care of. If the safety officer gives you an order, you follow it immediately, just as if the incident commander was giving you the order. The public information officer, these are the ones that only people that talk to the media. So on a big scene, you can get in a lot of trouble if you go and talk to the media without PIO present. They're trained, they know what information needs to be told. Sometimes there's information we don't want told because it would jeopardize the safety of the people responding. And then liaison officer, so they're the ones who basically take concerns from the general staff, so the section leaders, all the way up to the command staff. All right, talked about communication with 9/11. Historically, communication is the weakest points at the biggest incidents. Is people not having the ability to talk to each other. Before 9/11, our radios didn't talk to law enforcement. We had one channel we could get onto as long as somebody was monitoring it, and the other agencies were on it, and we could talk to each other on it. Now that's changed, and we've changed it so that our radios are programmed to talk to different law enforcement agencies, even different utility companies. So when we check our radios, it's really important that we're checking them, but also making sure that we have the ability to speak to these other agencies. All right, so mobilization and deployment, this is exciting for everybody the first time they get to go on any sort of incident. You know, my agency responds to hurricanes. We responded to the COVID outbreak in New York and New Jersey, wildland fires. So these are all things that everybody gets excited when they get to go, and you have to be packed and ready to go. So you check in, they say with the incident commander, but there's actually a place that you check in with finance is usually who's sitting there at the check-in. Make sure that your agency know, or that they know your agency's there and that individually you're there. And then you report to whoever you're supposed to report to. You're assigned something, so you're assigned an area, and you report to that supervisor. And then they keep track of you while you're there. People who forget to check in when they get to a scene or to an incident, they don't get paid after the incident's over. So we have accountability to know where everybody's at, to make sure your communication equipment is appropriate and it's working, your batteries are good. And then we check in regularly, and there are times we get updates. So there's usually a morning and an evening briefing on big incidents. So you get that update. It used to be whoever was in charge of your section would go to the update and then brief you guys. Now it's usually done by Zoom or on Facebook Live or on YouTube, so we can all watch it if we have self-service available and we're not busy doing stuff. And then we have within your sections or your groups, we have specific times and goals that we need to achieve and check-in times. So if I'm out walking a line on a wildland fire, they need to know where I'm at and that we're checking in regularly, right, with our radios, and have a plan if you can't check in. And then once the incident's been stabilized, doesn't mean that it has been, you know, completely like controlled, like a fire has been completely put out. But when it's stabilized, let's say that it's not growing any further. Incident command team is going to decide what resources to start releasing. And then, you know, we can slowly call it demobilization, where the scene is de-escalating and they're able to control it and start, you know, releasing resources, especially in Arizona in the summer. with wildland, releasing resources to go to other fires that are going on. Today in Tucson, there were 3 fires, 3 big fires, to 3 different agencies in 3 different areas were responding to fires. So that was taking additional resources, and they had the mutual aid between these resources. Well, as soon as those fires are put, not necessarily out, but it's under control, the incident commander on the scene for those fires can release resources so that they can go out in the rest of the city, because there's still things going on in the rest of the city when all these incidents are going on. All right, so preparedness. So we need to be prepared and ready. The planning team is part of this, but also within the agencies. So there are decisions made above, the basic boots on the ground level. If something happens, if X happens, Y and Z will respond to it in this area. And those are kind of made ahead of time so that when it does occur, they're ready and we can deploy the resources. So they think about things that are most common. So we have flash floods here. We do have hurricanes that come up, but they tend not to be very bad and it's very rare. But wildland fires is another one, structure fires, especially fires that overlap, and you have multiple jurisdictions responding to it. Massive accidents on the freeway where, we have big pileups on the freeway. So those are things that we can prepare for in advance. And then when something happens, we can put our plans into action. So the same thing that we're going to do if you're first on scene, and that can happen when you're first on scene, even if it's a small accident, you still have that same obligation for safety to everybody else. You're in charge of that scene until somebody else shows up. And you need to make sure that you're painting a good picture for whoever's coming next, like whatever resources you're bringing in, right? So you're seeing size up, we show up, what are we seeing, all right? We have to make that decision. We have to make sure we're notifying dispatch and letting them know what resources we need to have. Now, on the other side of that, let's say that there's multiple vehicles involved in a car accident. The dispatchers will have a certain amount of resources that they automatically dispatch to certain incidents. But make sure that you're communicating that, what do we have in front of us? What do I need immediately? Right? And what do I need to do at this moment to make it safe for everybody, as safe as possible, safe for my crew, and then plan out for where my resources are going to come in. So this talks about command being established early and by the most senior official. This is true for fire departments. Sometimes it's by the person that has the highest certification, and sometimes it's by the person who has the most experience. My old partner and I, we ran calls all the time down south by just her and me. And it was whoever didn't get out of the truck first had to grab the radio and take command. So we notify other responders what hazards there might be. And then, do we want a helicopter coming in? Do we need hazmat? Do we need, traffic control, those sorts of things. And again, some of that's already automatically dispatched, but it's things that you can ask for anyway to make sure you have them. All right, communication. We want to limit radio traffic. When you're coming up on scene, you just say, command, your unit number, approaching and requesting. Long-winded radio transmissions when you have a major incident going on causes a lot of problems. We don't need to talk, but we do need to listen very carefully. All right, so medical incident command is the medical branch or EMS branch under operations. So we deal with triage, treatment, transport. That's what we do. We're not involved in complex extrication, things like that. So underneath each one of these, triage, treatment, transport, and we'll do triage tags in class because it's really hard to kind of teach triage over the computer. But it's basically establishing the severity of your patients and who's going to go where, right? Treatment, we're to assign certain patients to be treated. When you come up on the scene, you don't get to pick. If you're coming into a scene where you're requested as a resource, you don't get to pick what you get to do. You don't get to go to the coolest patient or the most messed up patient. We're assigned our patients. And then transport, this is also if you're on an ambulance that can has transport capabilities. A lot of us will come in, we're assigned a patient, take that patient, treat him, and then transport him off the scene. We have to take our patients specifically to the hospital that we're assigned, not the hospital the patient wants to go to, because when an accident or a big incident happens, incident commander is also calling all the hospitals to figure out who can take what level of patients and how many. So we don't get to freelance where we're sending our patients. All right. All right, so triage, the triage supervisor is the person that's basically in charge of making sure that every patient has been triaged, every victim has been triaged, and we have to triage before we start moving people to the treatment center. So we don't start treatment until everybody's been triaged. We don't go hunt out for the most severe one and then try and poke around. You walk up to the first patient that you come up against, you triage them, and you move on to the next. Triage does not mean treat. It means to sort your patients out. All right, treatment supervisor. We set up, while triage is going on, the treatment person is going to set up and put together the treatment area. It's usually further away from where the initial scene was. It's a place where it's a little bit safer. They allow for egress and regress of ambulances or of medical personnel to come in with their gurneys and take patients away. Treatment supervisor also helps with moving people to the transport area. And then transport supervisor, they make sure the vehicles are pulling them to a safe location. They're not driving over the scene or over where we have patients down, kind of staged. A lot of times the triage person becomes the transport person because they can keep an accurate count from triage, how many patients we triage, how many do we transport. The transportation supervisor also coordinates with the incident commander to see what hospitals we're sending what patients to. So they call UMC, University of Maine, and they say, hey, we can take, 30 greens, 10 reds, and 15 yellows. So the incident commander writes all that down, hands it off to the transportation person while treatment's going on. And that transportation person can basically say, okay, you're taking this unit's taking this patient here. We transport patients in up to 3 at a time for ones that are critical. We can fit multiple patients in the ambulance. The more common is one on the bench and one on the gurney. But don't be surprised if you are assigned 2 patients to transport out. You'll be going to the same hospital, but if they don't have enough resources to come in and transport the patients one at a time. Staging supervisor, if there's enough personnel for it, this is where we have a lot of agencies responding. The staging person also kind of becomes like a logistics person. So they kind of say, this is where we're going to have maybe the command post. We need to make sure that we've got a staging area. Say we have heavy equipment that's going to vibrate. They've got to wait over here, and they allow people to go in and out of the scene. If there's a physician on scene, some jurisdictions will take hospital physicians out from base hospitals to make tough decisions. It's not very common, but it can happen. And then sometimes we'll have physicians that do the patient care. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody stops and says, I'm a doctor, I want to take over the scene. That doesn't work like that. They have to be board certified emergency physicians, and they're basically taking responsibility for the patients on their licensure when they come to a scene. Rehab supervisor, this also goes on over in the staging area. So sometimes more common than not, they'll put a rehab center, rehab area kind of offset from the scene, especially if it's kind of a gory scene, so that the personnel, the responders have a place to go to breathe, basically. If they've had to have apparatus on, like SCBAs, or carrying around heavy equipment, they will get their vital signs checked again before they're allowed to go back in. Usually firefighters, when we rotate out their bottles of air, they're told to report to rehab first. Give them hydration, foods, sunscreen, shade, stuff like that we need. Extrication special rescue, this is kind of cool. They function under the EMS sector or the fire sector, depending on where you're at and what personnel are responding to the scene. You have to have special training, though, to be on the extrication special rescue team. But things like SARA, search and rescue, will be underneath this. Swiftwater rescue could fall underneath this. Tactical rescue could fall underneath this. A morgue supervisor, so when we have a treatment area, we have basically 3 different areas, red, yellow, and a green for patients, and then we have a black area. The black area tarp is for patients that are dead or will be dead, soon to be dead, and that person needs that tarp needs a supervisor just like the rest of the different tarps would need. Once resources become available, they go back and re-triage all the patients that were put onto the morgue or the black tag for dead or almost dead or dying, and see if there's any resources available to help those people. Triage is seems pretty harsh. Basically, you're doing the most good with what you have for the most amount of people. So we don't always, we don't spend time doing CPR on somebody that's in cardiac arrest when we've got 10 other patients. All right, mass casualty, your book says it involves 3 or more patients. Puts a lot of demand on us, the EMS system. It can also put a large demand on the fire, depending on if we have rescue. If your system in your state or your agent or your area has fire and EMS kind of working together. All right. So when we declare an MCI, basically we don't have enough resources to treat and transport all the patients at the same time. So I can't pull up to a scene, have 10 patients there, pick out my 2 favorites, say, don't worry, people are coming for you. All right. I have to mitigate that scene until additional resources show up. My partner and I have to mitigate it. So we initiate the triage system, and then we go through and we treat the ones that we can. All right, so just like with any other disaster scene, what do we have? What do we need? And what are we going to do? Okay. I'll put the videos that were supposed to be in this up onto the Google Drive as well. So triage literally means to sort. Primary triage is done in the field, and then we do a secondary triage when we get them to the treatment areas. All right. We'll go over this in class because it is hard to describe how to triage over a video. So the categories of triage is going to be immediate, they're red, delayed is yellow, and then green is walking wounded. Black is the expectant to die or likely to die or already dead. We use this, it's a black tag with stripes on it sometimes, to use that as a morgue tag. So this one gives you a whole bunch of lists of things, and I know I've said it over and over, I don't like lists. So we use a system called RPM to do triage. And RPM, if we don't talk about it here, we'll talk about on the board. It's respirations, perfusion, and then purposeful movement. So R, respirations, perfusion, do they have distal perfusion, and movement. That's all we go through. So instead of remembering lists of things that could be wrong with people, you use your RPM to go down, and they fall into either the red, the yellow, the green, or the black category. So start triage, simple triage, and rapid transport. All right, that's all that this means. Start triage is the industry standard right now. Jumpstart is for pediatric patients, so you need to know this for the test. Those are children that are younger than 8, appear to be younger than 8, right, who appear to be weigh less than 100 pounds. And then it also accounts for patients who have communication barriers, all right? So the first thing we're gonna do, we're gonna say, okay, if you were involved in this accident, I want you over here. If you were a bystander and you witnessed it, I want you over here. Doesn't mean everybody's gonna get up and walk. Basically, I just initiated triage. I sorted out who was a patient, who wasn't a patient, and my walking wounded or my green. Everybody that got up and moved that was part of this scene, part of this accident, they are walking wounded. They get tagged green regardless of what's wrong with them. Then we move on to the next, right? So we go down, we walk up to the next person. They are by default either a red, yellow, or black, all right? So if we walk up to them, right, they're breathing, their rate's less than 30, all right, we can gauge without counting 30, all right, we move on to perfusion. But if they're breathing less than or greater than 30 times a minute, they're automatically red tag. Move on to perfusion. If they perfuse, meaning that they have capillary refill time is less than 2, we move on to movement. But if their capillary refill time is greater than 2, they're automatically a red, and we move on to the next patient. Right? If we have them and their capillary refill time is less than 2, all right, and they can follow simple commands, meaning I just want them to touch their nose, I want them to touch their ears, or they're telling us what happened, that's good. They are a yellow because they didn't get up and walk away with the green, all right? Otherwise, they're a red. If they can't follow commands, purposeful movements, they're a red. Now, the only other thing is, if they are not breathing when you walk up to them, we're allowed to perform a jaw thrust on an adult, a jaw thrust and insert an airway. If with a jaw thrust and an airway, they start breathing on their own, they're automatically a red, and we move to the next patient. With pediatrics, we can open their airway, insert an adjunct if we need to, and provide 2 rescue breaths using a mask. If they start breathing after 2 rescue breaths, they're a red. If they don't start breathing, you have to walk away, all right, and they're a black label. That's really hard to do. Trouble is we don't start doing treatment because as soon as you start providing treatment to one person, you get sucked into the treatment of that one person, and there's still all these other patients that are laying around. So it's kind of like we take everything that we've taught you all semester and we say, hey, by the way, when we have a mass casualty, I want you to forget all that. All right. All right, other things, special considerations. So patient who's hysterical, we might have to bump them up just because they're disturbing the scene and making it more chaotic. The big one right here that you'll see on tests, a responder who becomes sick or injured during the rescue effort is an immediate priority because their injury or their illness happened right then. That's something that we can mitigate much easier than somebody who we had to respond to the scene, go through the entire triage procedures, things like that. So if we had it happen right now, they are an immediate, all right, because, and they're one of the responders. And then we also have this extra step where we have to deal with contaminated patients that might be hazmat. I'll talk about hazmat in a little bit, and then we'll talk about the triage tags and what we do for patients that have to be deconned. All right, so destination decisions, your book says, you know, patients that are red or yellow are transported by ground or air ambulances, okay? Buses, a lot of times can take walking wounded, and I've actually called for buses. And then immediate priority patients transported 2 at a time until they're transported from the site. And again, that depends on the resources that are available. All right, so patients that, when we transport them, again, this is the incident commander that's going and calling the hospital. I used to think incident command was the easiest job. They show up on the scene, they sit in their air-conditioned truck or their heated truck, depending on what time of year it is, and they sit and talk on the phone and the radio the whole time. And then I had to do it one time on a smaller scene, and I was like, this sucks, because you're calling the hospital, you're responsible for everybody's safety, you've got your units coming in, you're monitoring how much time somebody's been on scene, you're watching, making sure that, thinking 4 or 5 steps ahead of the game. So incident commanders should never be involved in the scene taking care of patients because they lose their objectivity. They end up getting that tunnel vision into what they're doing. Even if they just pick up a piece of equipment and hand it off, the incident commander shouldn't even be doing that. All right, disaster management, again, disasters can involve personnel, but it just could be damage to property. It could be something that blocks access to emergency services. It could be something like power goes out and it's 107 degrees out. What are we going to do for that sort of thing? Okay, so our job is to report and do what we're told, okay? And till we're released from that or we transport off the scene. And even when you transport, you get to the hospital, you turn over your patient care, sometimes we're ordered back to the scene. Just depends on the dispatch and what's going on. All right, hazardous material, you should have done the hazardous material, introduction to hazardous materials through the NIMS. So that was the longest class through NIMS. With hazardous materials, it's recognizing when there's a hazardous situation to make sure that we're not making ourselves victims of that situation as well. All right, so we have this HAZWOPER, which is the 24-hour responder or 24-hour class. It's called HAZWOPER, first response. This is something that you can take. This is a step up of what you guys took with NIMS, but it's understanding what things look like and how to use our the books, right? The little orange books that we have to determine, you know, safest way to deal with some different types of exposure. We are not, you go through specialized training to be a hazardous material technician or hazmedic. So we just deal with initial response. And the biggest part is controlling it, meaning that you don't want people coming into your scene and keeping yourself from getting sick, all right? All right, so take time is not your emergency, so don't turn it into your emergency. That's the biggest thing I could tell you with any of these scenes, any patient, going to any scene, it's not your emergency, so don't turn it into your emergency. All right, take a breath, take time to look and see what's going on, and anything that could indicate a hazardous scene, a violent scene, something that's dangerous, okay? All right, so when fuel is leaking from a vehicle or some other smoke is coming off a vehicle, remember if it's overheated, the steam is going to be white. Any other colored vapor coming off of the vehicle or any other colored smoke coming off the vehicle, it's burning, it's not good. And if you're not trained and don't have the resources or the equipment, you should not be dealing with that. All right. So this goes through a bunch of the different ways that hazardous materials can be involved. Also know your target hazard areas. So places where you have a higher likelihood of encountering hazardous materials. And that includes people's garages. If you've ever looked in somebody's garage, a lot of people put unlabeled stuff into their garages, cans. So when it's on fire, it becomes an issue. But for us responding, I mean, you can have fumes. If somebody's been overcome by fumes, those are not situations you want to put yourself in the middle of. You want to have that patient pulled out. Now, if I walk into the classroom and everybody's unresponsive, I'm walking back out. All right, that's just the way it is, because I can't save all of you, and whatever overcame everybody in that room to become unresponsive, that I'm now at risk for it. So I walk out and I call for additional resources to come in. All right, so things that we think about: occupancy and location. If you think about, we have a call at Raytheon or at the mine, pesticides that we might deal with. People, you know, we've got the pecan fields and we've got all this agriculture around southern Arizona. All of those, when somebody, depending on the nature of the call out and what you guys are listening to and what you start thinking about, starting putting all those pieces together, those can potentially be hazardous material scenes, right? So sight and sound are the only two senses we should be using on a scene, right? That's it. We shouldn't be smelling things, tasting things. You can listen to stuff, but sometimes even the noise pollution on scenes makes that difficult. Containers, different types of containers store different types of material in them. When you take your hazardous material, if you're going to Fire Academy, the 24-hour hazardous material responder, you have to learn the different types of containers and what kind of stuff can be inside them. All right, so if that container looks like it's really well reinforced and secondary containment systems in it, we know that there's something in there they really don't want leaking out. So common sense plays a big part in looking at containers, okay? So are they reinforced, the shape of the container, sometimes the color of the container, but I don't always go off of that because people put stupid things and make it look like it's a water container and it's not. Here's one that's super reinforced. So they really don't want that container expanding under any situation. And then fluid containers. Again, it could be anything in here. You don't make assumptions as to what's inside containers. So we also have a label system, placard marking system. Boxes might have packaging labels with them. Anything you can do to try and find out what substance was inside a container, all right? Placards look like this. They have a number. They have kind of a hazard icon on it, and then there's like a level, all right? So part of our training and part of your first responder or first response to 24-hour training is to learn what all of these mean. Now, we also have this book called the ERG. Inside the ERG, there's a page that has the placard system, so it tells you the kind of materials that are in there. So you at least have an idea of what you're going into. Not every vehicle, though, has a placard that's true to what's on it, especially ones that we have coming in and out of different countries. And some of them have the mixed containers. So like a Walmart truck's gonna have a mixed placard because it's got some of everything in it. All right, DOT doesn't require certain chemical shipments are marked. So again, we have to be careful. We have to use a high index of suspicion with things, and we need to make sure that we're maintaining our own safety. This is our ERGs. They come out every few years. The ERG, this is another thing we'll show you in class. We have several copies of it. You can get a download of it on your phone. It takes up a lot of space though, and it's not free. But you can look through it, and there's different sections on the ERG. So you can look up something by its number. So the chemical number that's underneath the placard right here, so 1268, I can look that up and it would tell me what it is. We can look it up underneath the health hazard. We can look it up, I mean, there's 5 different sections. There's 5 different ways to look stuff up in the ERG. So it'll be easier for us to show you that. Also shows us the first aid that we can perform with results, you know, depending on the type of exposure. Talks about safe handling, talks about how to neutralize different substances. And again, if we're not trained in neutralizing substances, we shouldn't be doing it, but having that information available. Every ambulance, emergency vehicle, I should say, needs to have one of these on it, okay? They need to have an ERG on them. All right, we also have these MSDS or SDS, these material data, safety data sheets. They keep changing the abbreviation for them. But every time we have a chemical that we're using in any setting, commercial setting, government setting, should have a safety sheet on it. So when somebody has an exposure, that safety data sheet will also tell, you know, how to perform what first aid, like rinsing the eyes, things like that. What makes it up a chemical, And then other things like how to store it, how to clean it up safely, and how to dispose of it. Even at Pima, we have safety data sheets for everything. Soap and the VeriGuard that we use, the hand sanitizer, all of those things have to have the data sheet, safety data sheets. We also have the shipping papers. You can look and see for things that are hazardous material and what was being shipped. I would say use this carefully because shipping papers, if they're still in the object that you don't want to get near, obviously that presents a problem. But that is another route where you can find clues. All right, and then when in doubt, there's a phone number in the back of the ERG. It's Chemtrek. You can call and they can give you, it's kind of like poison control for chemicals. So they can call and give you resources, information. Sometimes they respond. This is something that people don't necessarily like calling, especially with agencies, or like if you're at Amazon and they have a spill and they call Chemtrek because there's a fee or the fine associated, depending on what's going on associated with it. But it's information for us. All right, so other resources or other things that we can look. So is there smoke or plume or cloud escaping from that substance? Obviously you don't want to get close enough to it. Is there a leak coming out from it? Don't assume it's water from a radiator or fuel. We want to make sure that we're at a safe distance though, okay? Or noxious odors. I'm not going to take a real deep breath and smell anything, but if there's reports of strange odors, those are things that we want to be aware of and report as well. Call hazmat, the hazmat team quickly. Basically, we want to make sure if we're involved in that scene, we're going to have to be decontaminated anyway. Use if you have a loudspeaker on your ambulance, use that. Warn people to back off. Make sure you're clearly relaying to your dispatch center the orders or what landmarks are going to be for your scene. The rule of thumb is literally the rule of thumb. So if you have some sort of hazardous material situation and you're far enough back that you can cover it with your thumb, when you look at it, you're probably far enough away. I say go back a little further from it. It's not my emergency. I'm not trained or equipped for it, so I need to make sure I'm aware of that. Now, we also need to think about where we're going to stage. The book says uphill, upwind, right? I can tell you uphill is great because fluids roll down, so you want to make sure you're not where fluids or liquids are going to roll down to. But in Arizona, in southern Arizona, the wind goes different directions all the time. It changes directions because we're in a valley. So you might want to increase your distance from that hazardous material. I'm not saying leave the scene, be like, I'm out, see ya. Can't do that. But we can back off and stage at a safe distance, right? So it talks about control zones, securing access the best you can so that people don't enter into the contaminated area. That's huge. It's hard when people are screaming at you to go help people and you're like, I'm not equipped for this. So you start working on the things that you can do until the people who have the tools show up. All right, we talked about the hot zone and the warm zone a little bit when we talked about explosions, right, in Mod 5. Same kind of thing. So the hot zone is where the incident happened. And remember that hot zone can extend out. Warm zone is where we have decontamination. This is where people will go in, they'll have a decontamination of whatever they need, water, tips, scrubs, scrubbing people off. This is where we have the people that are trained, the hazardous material technicians are trained and they're in there. A lot of them are paramedics, so they can start initial patient care while they're decontaminating them. And then we are back in the cold zone, right? That's where the staging area is going to be. That's where the treatment center is going to be, treatment area, the transport area is going to be, all of those are going to be in the cold zone. All right. So our job again is triage, treatment, and transport, and then rehabilitation of responders themselves. So you can be called to a scene, a fire scene, hazardous material scene, any of those things. And we can be just in charge of rehabbing firefighters. So we take their blood pressure, we monitor their vital signs, we make sure they're drinking enough, water, fluid, replenishing, and that they don't look to be experiencing signs of physical stress on the scene. And we have a logbooks that we have to keep track of all that in to show that people were going to rehab. Triage, treatment, and transport again, though, this is a big part of what we do. All right, so classification of hazardous materials. This falls under the NFPA 704. You don't have a Texas question to remember the NFPA number. but it basically tells us health hazards, toxicity, and the type of PPE we're going to need. Right? So it's also where they get the kind of color coded for these placards. Toxicity level. So the higher number, the toxicity level, the greater danger it is to us when we're looking at toxicity levels. Right? So with the 4 level, toxicity level 4, little bit of exposure can immediately cause us death. So they need to have this specialized level A suit, all right? If toxicity level is 0, there's little or no hazard, right? And then slightly hazardous, 1 and 2, CBAs, right? And then the level C suit. Extremely hazardous, this is where they have a completely encapsulated suit with no skin or a special protective clothing that they put on that doesn't have any skin exposed. Right? So then we switch it when we go to PPE level. So a level 4 toxicity is most hazardous, but a level A hazmat suit, this is where they have everything sealed in together. They kind of look like the guys from Monsters Incorporated. They're walking around in 2314, whatever it is, when the humans kind of get into the monsters world. So they are sealed in, they have air supply within it. It's hard to move around in it, it's incredibly hot. Level B is non-encapsulated protective clothing. So we have to have our own air supply with level B, eye protection as well. Level C is non-permeable clothing, face masks that have filters that filter the outside air, right? And level D is our uniforms. All levels use gloves, and I would tell you all levels need some sort of eye or face shield protection as well. So level A, level B, they're in the Nomex. Level C, and they're in Nomex with the SCBA or breathing apparatus. Level C, they're in Nomex with face shield, helmet, and then they've got a special filter mask. And then level D is like an N95, and then basically their work clothes, gloves, and helmet. So caring for patients, again, we do the simplest stuff. We do stabilization of our patients. And when they get into the, especially the decontaminated, they're going to do basic decontamination, patient care, maybe intubation of these patients. It's really hard to provide patient care and even deal with an airway when you're wearing that big old bulky hazmat suit. So they do the bare minimum that they have to do to keep the patient alive. And then we also have to think about things like the trauma or mechanisms that have occurred, as well as the hazardous material that they've been exposed to. They will be secondarily deconned at the facility. It's also our job to make sure that the facilities know that this patient's been deconned once. Also things to think about if you're flying patients out, make sure you let the helicopter crew know that they have been deconned once and what the substance they were exposed to. Because the helicopter is a tiny little space, and if somebody has exposure to something they're still off-gassing from their skin, that puts the entire flight crew at risk. Okay, so let's see. Decontamination, caring for patients, airway issues. So we need to increase the amount of our protective clothing, have extra gloves available, make sure you're taking them off. SCBAs we don't wear unless you're trained for them and have them available in your agency. All of us should have eye protection. So safety glasses, goggles, or the face shield, or a combination of all those. Sometimes we have masks that have face shields that come up. Protective clothing, respiratory protection, the highest level we have on the ambulance right now for us. If you're on an ambulance and not a fire rescue, it's going to be an N95. And then we have gowns that are available as well. We even have some Nomex suits that are available depending on what we're transporting. All right, that is the end of that chapter. I am going to have you guys go ahead and show you our NIMS. So I want to make sure that you're aware that the NIMS website, you have the ICSs on here. This link is in your D2L shell for you, okay? And you should have IS 100C, 200C, 700B, and 800D. Now these letters might have changed. At the end where I put them in D2L, the link might say 800B or C, but that's fine. It'll take you directly to the class that you need to use. The link is still current, okay? So make sure that you have that, as well as your IS5, which is your hazardous material. We need to make sure you guys have all of those done and completed before we can let you pass the class, because it is a co-requisite for this class. You need to make sure that you have that done. All right, as always, Let us know if you've got questions. Bring questions with you to the Q&A section. Things that you might want to review to Q&A. Remind your instructor to go over triage tags with you and the ERG books, the orange books with you in class, because we didn't have the availability to do that on the computer. It's a little bit more difficult than just showing you in real life how to do it. Let us know if you have any questions. Make sure you're doing your quizzes and asking questions, or are there things you want to review for your quizzes as well. Thanks.